Hello again, and thank you for joining us. So happy to have you today. We'd like to start by thanking our MSCHE colleagues, Becca DeHaven, Victoria Clark, and Lindsay Bell for supporting this webinar behind the scenes. We'd also like to welcome our two ASL interpreters, Joy Harris and Jessie Lee. Please be aware that ASL interpreters are available to pin, or you can click the interpretation button on your Zoom toolbar and select ASL to populate the interpreter in a separate window. Closed captioning is also available through the Zoom menu bar. Please be reminded that this webinar will be recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to viewers. We ask that you not record the webinar yourself or otherwise make a reproduction of the content thereof. Thanks again for joining us and welcome to Crafting the Self-Study Report, Telling Your Self-Reflection Journey, hosted by the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. My name is Melissa Harden. I'm the lead vice president for institutional field relations with the Commission. I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Terrence Peavy, vice president for institutional field relations. Also joined by Mr. Joseph Hawk. Joseph is the executive director of assessment and accreditation at Drexel University in Philadelphia, where he facilitates assessment across the university. He's also the co-chair of the Drexel Assessment Conference. As the accreditation liaison officer, Joseph oversees institutional accreditation for the university and supports the different colleges and schools with their corresponding 30+ programmatic accreditors. He was the co-chair of the Drexel self-study team in April 2024 and also serves as a Middle States peer evaluator. We're so pleased that Joseph will share his institution's self-study experience with us today. We'd like to start by pointing to our learning outcomes for the day's event. Number one, understand the purpose and significance of a self-study report. Identify the essential elements that make your story stand out. Develop effective approaches to editing work group reports. Identify strategies for soliciting feedback from the campus community. Apply strategies to gather and present supportive data and evidence. And enhance your report's impact with visual aids. We want to invite our viewers to pose questions and comments using the Q&A function that appears in the participant panel. Feel free to submit your questions or comments at any time throughout the presentation. We will pause periodically to respond. Remember that while we can address general matters during this session, you can discreetly discuss specific issues for your institution with your assigned vice president liaison. All right, so we're going to get into the meat of our presentation today, starting with the self-study report and overview. A self-study report is the written result of years of collective effort, research, and analysis carried out by all constituencies of an institution. Fundamentally, self-study is an obligation for member institutions to demonstrate that they meet or exceed expectations, standards of accreditation, requirements of affiliation, regulations, and policies and procedures. It also represents, for the members of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, an invitation to engage in and present for peer review and feedback, deep reflection about how education is designed and delivered, and how that project can be enhanced within the context of each institution's unique mission and goals. This is no small undertaking, and it can certainly be daunting for the inexperienced and the experienced alike. In a moment, we'll break down self-study into distinct phases, but first let's consider the significance of the report itself. The self-study report serves as the primary narrative that asserts and demonstrates that an institution is in compliance. The report references and makes clear the relevance of all supporting documentation found in the evidence inventory. The report provides a thorough analysis of the alignment of institutional mission and priorities within the standards for accreditation, requirements of affiliation, regulatory requirements, and policies and procedures. Successful self-study reports are the result of clear and thorough processes. These begin with the institution's commitment to developing a strong self-study design. The self-study report is a collaborative effort. All institutional constituencies should be encouraged to engage in the work in ways that are meaningful to them. Self-study is a lengthy process. So each institution should develop its own system that is well organized and planned strategically so that it can be sustained over an extended period of time. I'd like to turn now to Joseph. He's the expert on our panel today, and invite him to share some initial thoughts about the self-study process. Joseph, tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa and Terrence, for having me here today. This is really an awesome opportunity for me to share a lot of advice and experiences that I've had, just like people did for me when I was doing my self-study. One thing from the very beginning, there's not only one way to do this. Like, really figure out this is one person's story. If I had just general advice, play to your strengths. If you're a really well-organized person, be a well-organized person as you run it. And also know your weaknesses and surround yourself with people that help you get through those weaknesses as well. Remember, I did this. Mine started my process, and most of it was done during the pandemic, and my boss had retired, and I was by myself for a long period of time. So if I can do this all on Zoom by myself, you can do it too. Everybody can do this process. As hard as it is, it's so equally satisfying to get through to the end.
We have here a couple of thoughts that you put together for us. Joseph, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about building that support system in your experience.
Absolutely. One thing that I say from the beginning, and I would be more than happy to play this role for anybody that needed it as well, as mentor up. Don't do this on your own. Make sure that you have somebody that's gone through this process before. Make sure that they kind of understand and you like working with them, because you're going to need them during this process as well. Just know from the beginning, this is one of the hardest things you might ever do. It can be lonely at times, because you can sometimes feel the weight of the university on your shoulders, even though that's not really the case. It's also, like I said, this was the most proud I've ever been in my entire career after 2.5 years of going through this process, as hard as it was. One big thing for us that was really important at Drexel was to be as representative as possible. Faculty, professional staff, students. We have 14 academic colleges and schools at Drexel, so we had 14 academic colleges and schools represented within our steering committee and within our working groups as well. So be as representative as possible. It makes accreditation be really, really meaningful. It makes it be integrated into your work. And that's another point I want to get to too, is make sure that you tie this into university initiatives so that accreditation means something. So it's not 2.5 years of collecting syllabi and doing other work that doesn't really fit into everybody's everyday work. Be as transparent as possible, have a great communication plan, answer questions, make sure you let people know where you're at in the process so they can chime in and be a part of the process as well. We had over 100 people on our working groups, but that we actually had many more stakeholders participate in this process. So make sure that people can get involved if they want to. This actually has led to people wanting to be more involved with accreditation in the long term. When we're going through accreditation again, when we have our next cycle, I think we'll have an even easier time of finding volunteers for this as well. And like I said, build your support system. Upper administration, you have to have really key people there supporting you, but also knocking down doors for you, also greasing the wheels for you. You have to have champions up at the upper levels to basically make sure that people make space for you and they get you the results that you need during the process. But also, they're available to do the reviews that you need them to do. They're available to answer questions. They're available to shape the report in and of itself. Because remember, as an ALO too, as much as it feels like it's your report, it's really the president of the university's report. It's really the provost's report that you're really going through. So remember, you need to be working with them hand in hand to make sure that you're developing a report that they want to put their name on as well. Have tech support. I had a wonderful person through this whole process named Michael Shelmet, who's in charge of our instructional learning group at Drexel University, who did so much tech for me on campus, set up our evidence inventory. It was just a really nice thing not to have to worry about. Have your people that you can vent to. That's a really important one too. Have somebody's office you can walk into that you can just talk about Middle States and how you're frustrated. Not Middle States itself, but the process. And it could be even who you're dealing with on campus. You're going to have all these frustrations at these points because you're going to have so much anxiety because of that looming deadline. So have somebody you can talk to. And honestly, be prepared. And I'm going to go back to a coach that I love to follow because my part-time, I do lots of coaching as well. Be prepared to love your steering committee because you're going to be in the foxhole with them for about 2.5 years. And you're going to be in close meeting with them weekly or bi-weekly. You're going to ask things of them that you might not normally ask of them to do. They're going to have to do this outside of their normal jobs. So be prepared to love your steering committee. And what I mean by that is know them very well and know what they need. Some of them needs a cheerleader. Some of them need a strict deadline to make sure they get things done. Some of them you can have more flexibility with them and they can run through their own thought processes. And some of them are going to need a lot more guidance to get through this process as well. So you really have to get to know them to know what they need, because they're going to feel as much responsibility for this document as you are. So that building that steering committee is really essential. And one last point I want to make about that is fill it with people. The most important thing, in my opinion, is fill it with people that you know can get the job done. It's not necessarily what their background is. I mean, there are some standards where you could say it's really good to have a person that's very knowledgeable in that standard. But remember, you can always fill in your working group with people that are experts in that area. So if you go the model that we did, where our steering committee was made up of the co-chairs of each one of our standards or working groups, they don't necessarily have to be experts in that area because you can fill it in. But they were people on our campus that I knew when it came down to it, they could get the job done. And they didn't have to have really high titles, because you can have an executive committee to meet with you as well. But they have to be people that can get the job done. And that's the best thing that I did during this whole process, was built this wonderful steering committee. And some of them are actually on this call today, which is really cool too, that 2 years later after our process. And we worked really hard through this pandemic. Some of them I didn't even meet until after everything was done. We got to shake each other's hands because we've been on Zoom for so long. So build a wonderful steering committee that you don't mind spending that much time with, and that you know you can count on through the whole way through.
Thanks, Joseph. Really nice observations. It really is a tremendous burden of responsibility, and it can be easy for the ALO to conclude that it's theirs alone. But, you make a good point when you talk about the need to build a really strong team that can support all the work and keep it going. So thank you. We appreciate that. All right. So as I mentioned before, there are several important phases involved in developing a comprehensive and inclusive self-study report, and you can see them here. First stage, planning and preparing. Second stage, conducting research. Third, writing the report. And fourth, refining the report. So it's not done until it's done. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. We can't emphasize enough the need for collective commitment and participation across the entire institutional community to make the self-study report not only achievable, but also useful for the institution's own needs and interests. Joseph said just a moment ago, clearly this is an obligation that institutions have to fulfill. But in order for individuals and groups to be motivated and to do the work over the course of this process, they need to see some interest, some reward, some usefulness for the process for their own efforts. So really important to look at that. So if we do look at this planning and preparing phase, it's important to take the time to plan and prepare for what represents this monumental task of extraordinary importance for the institution. In this first phase, the institution will identify a dozen or more representatives to take part in the Self-Study Institute, or SSI as we call it for short. The SSI is designed to familiarize the cohort of institutions that are embarking on self-study with the standards for accreditation, requirements of affiliation, and so forth, that together are used to evaluate compliance. It's also an opportunity to hear from peers from institutions who have recently undergone self-study and learn from their experiences. The small group discussions led by vice president liaisons and co-facilitators from institutions who also recently completed self-study create an interactive space for key institutional representatives who are involved in leading the self-study process on their campuses. This series of events helps position institutions to develop an effective self-study design. A month or two after the conclusion of the SSI program, the vice president liaison has a conference call with the leaders of the self-study to answer questions and provide guidance as the steering committee drafts its self-study design. Once a draft of the self-study design is submitted, the vice president conducts what we call the self-study preparation visit. This day-long campus visit includes meetings between the vice president liaison and the CEO, the self-study steering committee, members of the board of trustees, as well as an open forum for faculty, staff, and students. The visit serves several purposes. 1, to provide feedback on the self-study design. 2, to educate the community about the value of self-study and accreditation and the process of evaluation and peer review. And 3, to acquaint the vice president with the institutional community and culture to help inform the selection of the future evaluation team chair and members. Soon after the visit, the vice president provides written feedback on the self-study design, and the steering committee revises and resubmits the design. Once the design is deemed completed, the vice president accepts it on behalf of the commission and records it in the institutional review. That document then serves as the roadmap for the institution to carry out its self-study. And that, esteemed colleagues, is the first phase of crafting the self-study report. As we like to say, the better you prepare, the better the outcome. Or put another way, slow and steady wins the race. There is a bit of a learning curve that leads up to the actual start of an institution's self-study. So we'd like to turn now again to Joseph and ask him to tell us a little bit about that runway as you experienced and the various elements that led to the beginning of the self-study report.
Yeah, thanks. And this was really, the essence of beginning this, to make this a representative endeavor. We were very conscious about talking about this upcoming thing that was going to happen. We had our self-study institute about, I think it was in 2019 or 2020. Yeah. I'm losing track. It was about two and a half years before, or a little bit before that, we actually went through our self-study process. And when we got to Self-Study Institute, we had an idea of who our self-study steering committee was going to be. It was a faculty and staff representative for each one of the different standards. We also had a committee to do our compliance reporting as well. So we had 8 working committees. And I also had a faculty co-chair with me, which was Rena Cumby, who was part of our faculty senate. She was wonderful during the whole process as well. I will say that I do think that the Self-Study Institute was wonderful during my time. Much like this here, they had practitioners that kind of put their everyday experience with what was being told to us by Middle States as well. It was very beneficial, especially if you've never gone through self-study before, to learn all this information, to learn all the steps, to start thinking from the end of it all the way to the beginning, always thinking about that last deadline where you're going to have things happening. The self-study design template, it's nice. It's a very iterative process for this. You really have to think of your priorities. You really think about who your committee is going to be. You really want to think about what sort of evaluation committee you're looking for. And those questions are going to be answered in your steering committee, but also for senior administration as well. Our president was very involved with the types of people that he wanted to see come onto campus to talk about us at Drexel. We have lots of experiential learning. We're an R1 institution. We wanted to see if we could get people that had some experience with that to give us some feedback as well on our campus. As we developed our priorities for the self-study design template, we were actually going through a strategic planning process. So it was nice to have those priorities be the same ones. And we really did use that as a template kind of going forward to think about what we might want to ask as far as research questions for our full self-study report. This last point you have on the slide, lean on your liaison. I will say that I would not have made it through this process without Dr. Robert Bonfiglio, who's my Middle States liaison. He was just wonderful through the whole process. Not only was he available to meet with me when I needed to meet with me, or answer questions when he needed to answer questions, but he was such a support system for me, someone who had never gone through this process before, someone, like I said before, who was feeling alone, not only because of COVID, but because of my office. My boss had just retired before then. So, really lean on your liaison. They're going to be the person that interprets things for you, because sometimes Middle States standards can be a little bit general. Sometimes the questions can be a little bit general. They really help you sort through issues. And the other thing that Bob always did for me too, was he helped me not to sweat the small stuff. I swear there was one point where I was stressing days on the naming convention for my evidence inventory, which I think we can all say is not really that important as long as everybody can understand. But I just remember stressing until Bob said, pick whatever you want as long as it makes sense. And those were the words that I needed to hear. So as you're approaching this, really lean on your liaison. Make sure you have regular meetings with them in order to make sure that you cover all the questions that you have asked. He was, like I said before, he was really invaluable for me as we were approaching this process.
Thank you. Thank you for that shout out for Dr. Bonfiglio as well. We're going to pause now and move to questions from our viewers. So I'd like to ask my colleague, Dr. Peavy, Terrence, if you could call out a few of those questions and let's see what we can say.
All right. You touched on the steering committee formation, and there's a question from the audience that says, what are some advice that you would give regarding external steering committee members not employed by the institution?
That's a great, we actually didn't have steering committee members that weren't employed by the institution, but I have heard people having industry partners on steering committee. I've heard people having other people outside, maybe community members. We had talked about potentially having a parents representative that just didn't work out for us as well. I would say, I think it's a great idea. Specifically, if your university is really involved in the community, or really involved with community partnerships or industry partnerships, it's great to have that feedback as well. I will say sometimes it's hard to do scheduling. Sometimes it's hard when you're sharing documents because of technical issues, blah, blah, blah. But I think that that's a really good idea. I think one way you could do it is potentially, if they're not on the steering committee, you could have like an advisory committee that could meet with them and maybe do it monthly or quarterly, where you're updating them to where it's not as much of a heavy lift from them on the outside, and they still get to feel a part of the process.
Great, thank you. Again, staying with the theme of the steering committee and work groups, this individual asked the question, how far in advance should steering committees / work groups leads participate in the Self-Study Institute?
So I guess like how far ahead of time, like, that was kind of, I want to ask, this is a question for you guys as well. We had picked our steering committee before, and we had met just prior to that, but we hadn't picked our full working groups before that. But when I was at Self-Study Institute, not everybody was to that point. So I think it's kind of depends on your institution. I think it really worked well for us because we were waited to get that knowledge from the Self-Study Institute, and then we were ready to get going. So I think that's probably effective practice to have your steering committee ready. And we only had 2 individuals go to Self-Study Institute, but taking a whole steering committee to that, or a majority of them, would be really great for them. Only to understand the whole process has less time for you to explain it. So if you can get your steering committee, or at least a good portion of them together, or people that will be involved with the process, potentially even, I could see having the provost of Drexel going to that as well with us, because he's that involved with accreditation to understand what's going on. Or, potentially my boss, who's the head of IR on campus, just people that would be involved with this everyday process might be somebody that's smart to bring with you as well.
Well, just to follow up, Joseph, you brought up a great point about the status of Drexel and having your steering committee set. Having done three Self-Study Institutes, there's a wide variety of different scenarios that are kind of brought to the small groups when we have discussions. There are some schools that are fortunate enough to have made those decisions, but the Self-Study Institute also helps those institutions that are still in that formation stage. So it's not necessarily mandatory, but obviously if you already identified people and they can come to Self-Study Institute, that's great. But it's also an opportunity for those co-chairs that are still mulling about in terms of the working groups to get more ideas, because as you said earlier in your comments, you have this ability to be among peers, and a lot of good discussions and ideas are thrown about and actually inform some of the strategy going forward. So again, a combination of people that are there, but definitely it's an opportunity, Self-Study Institute, to get more ideas. Melissa, I don't know if you have more to add on that.
I've had the same experience. So I've had groups that come in and they've already formed even the working groups. They might even have charges, but I think that's the exception. We also have a number of groups that come in and, for many different reasons that are perfectly legitimate. There might be an upcoming transition in leadership. There might be staff changes anticipated. And so for those reasons, an institution may choose to delay a little bit the selection of the people who will be working on the steering committee or so forth. So absolutely no one should be concerned if going into the Self-Study Institute, they haven't yet made those decisions. That is part of the training that we provide.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there's plenty of time after that to get things figured out. So sometimes people get thrust into that role late too. So
Right.
just coming into it, trying to figure it out. So if you come into it and you don't have all that work done, you're not behind. You just have to make a schedule that works to fit around what you need to do.
In fact, I'd like to just point out that we've seen a number of groups that the steering committee co-chairs or members of the steering committee also go through transitions, right? And so it's just like any other natural part of university or institutional life, where those things do happen and they're part of the normal course of the work that we do. So no need to be concerned. You'll find, I think, camaraderie and collegiality among the peer institutions that you join in Self-Study Institute.
Joseph, you discussed the eighth committee in terms of your working group. And so the question here said, what specific role did the eighth committee, the one not devoted to a standard that Joseph mentioned, play?
So we had them work specifically on our verification of compliance report. So they collected that information and put that together so that we could put it together with standard 2, I believe, at the time. So that was a separate report. So we had them work specifically on that, so that it wouldn't need to be, so that when standard 2 could just focus on their section of on all the other criteria that they had involved.
All right. So I think we have a theme here in terms of getting started. There's the working group, there's a steering committee. Any best practices? I mean, you mentioned, of course, getting people that can do the work. Any other steps that you want to share with the audience? Because this is really the first part of the process for them.
Yeah, I would say one other thing too is develop a system for your evidence inventory. We used SharePoint for ours, but we had this really great uptake folder for it, and we had somebody in charge of that. So if you collected evidence, you could send it to this person and they would upload it. They weren't involved with a committee. They weren't involved with a working group. They were just in charge of evidence. So if we were all in working groups, me, Terrence, and Melissa, we could just submit an evidence in any form, and it would get formatted the way we wanted to, and then put into our evidence inventory and locked in by standard criteria, and then with a description, and you don't have to worry about that. You could just worry about collecting it and doing your narrative, and it's one less thing for your working groups to do.
Okay. All right, you just touched on evidence, so a question just popped up here. What would you advise when trying to get the okay for important documents, evidence, or key stakeholders want to get their last okay on everything? Sometimes it happens with sensitive information and it can be a struggle. So I guess, and just kind of tidying up this question, they're asking about the gathering of information and some of that sensitivity around it. How do you manage that? How do you kind of navigate that process?
It's a great question. I think you have to really have, we really had the opportunity to have Provost Paul Jensen on and President John Fry basically give us carte blanche to collect the information that we have. So you almost have to have executive sponsors. I'm just an executive director of an assessment accreditation. I'm not very high on the totem pole as far as senior administration goes, but when you see someone that has a provost tag or a president's tag on it, you get the information a little bit faster. I think it's really just about, and I say that jokingly, but it is kind of true. Like, you really need to have somebody who can kick down the doors for you. That's almost an executive sponsor. But in the same sense, you need to do groundswell work to be transparent and communicate about why you want this information and why it's important. And you do that through communication, and not just emails. I mean, they're fine. Webinars are fine, but you got to do some legwork too. You have to go to dean's meetings, associate dean's meetings. You have to go to department head meetings. You have to do quite a bit, faculty senate as well. Make sure everybody has their opportunity to ask questions and understand why you're asking for this information. And then as far as the sensitive information goes, you need to make sure that people are comfortable with how you're going to store this information and who's going to have access to it. So may need to show them that this is where it's going to go, and this is why you have that. So it's really about communication. This is a relationship game, if more than anything else. It's really just so people can trust you with what you're doing. Maybe you need to go to them to talk to them directly about it too. Sometimes there's extra time. So that's what I would say, build your relationships, but also, have somebody that can be the muscle when you need it.
Again, this question is tied to the theme of just getting the research ready. This individual asked the question, what are the assessment and reporting requirements for smaller micro-credentials or certificate programs, either credit or non-credit programs?
I mean, I would say these would basically go into your standard 5 educational effectiveness assessment. I would say that you would want to think about if you have standardized processes for these. I don't know if there's necessarily any right or wrong with what you'd have to have. And of course, on cue, there's my dog. I don't know if you have to have anything right or wrong involved with it, but as long as you have an organized assessment collection process, as long as you're collecting results and you're looking at those results and you're using those results, then I think whatever you have involved with that is fine as far as what we're meaning it. But what I'd say overall is just make sure it fits into your overall assessment process. So this isn't any different than we treat any other learning environment or learning process. It's the same as all your other programs as well.
Okay, so just again, staying within the phases, there's some questions that we'll answer as we get to that phase. So Melissa, unless, I don't know if you see any other questions that are applicable to this phase, but you can take it away.
I think I just want to answer one of the questions about SSI. So a person expresses a concern about what happens when those who joined the steering committee join relatively late, or let's say later, that is sometime after the SSI series of programs happens. So I can just fill you in that what we do with the SSI materials, we record all the plenaries and we make them available for months thereafter, up until actually quite a distance from there. So all the materials are still made available to the people who might come in and join the group later in the stage of development of this self-study report. I don't know, Joseph, did you have any cases of transition or needing to get people onboarded or up to speed in this process?
We actually have both. So like I said, the only people that went to Self-Study Institute, unfortunately for my institution, was myself and my boss who retired. So I was really the only one in the steering committee that went. So I had to develop a series of documents that basically showed kind of what it was. I shared the resources for that as well. But you as a chair, you almost want to go through all the information and kind of make it meaningful and specific for your institution. And while you do that, you actually understand it better yourself. There's no better way to understand things than to teach them. So go through the documents, think about what you need specifically, think about your timeline and your process for this too, and then go through the standards and think about what you want to see from each one of those standards. I will tell you something that's so much more helpful that we didn't have when I was going through it, is something we're going to talk a little about later, is the evidence guidelines that have now been provided for middle states. That's difficult because you want to just take a shotgun approach and attach 500 documents for each just to make sure you're covering everything. But to have something that gives a little bit of a framework, but allows you to be more specific for your institution, makes it much more calming for a standards co-chair to say, okay, here's the types of things that I have. Let me fill all those things up and let me supplement that with other things as well. And to go back to your question, we actually had a co-chair leave during the process too. So that was a little bit difficult during that time because a little bit stressful, the co-chair for one of our working committees. But the co-chair that we had that was staying was really, really strong. And we ended up just meeting a lot with that person and bring them up to speed. And this goes back to what I was saying with your steering committee before, as you're going through this process, this person naturally elevated from a working group to the co-chair of that group because she was a trustworthy person. She was very involved. I asked the co-chair who they thought might be a good person. And so their change was an easy one. And the person that was no longer the co-chair wanted to stay in the committee. So she stayed in the committee. She just couldn't handle being the co-chair and was very active in her role as well. So that part you said about being collegial is it also is with your university as well. And make sure you're that way as well. People are busy, and this is a 2.5-year process. So sometimes you're going to don't count on everybody being there at the end, just to be perfectly honest, and make sure you're ready for that sort of transition. We were fortunate to have all but 2 people there at the very end. And that, that I feel like we're lucky that way. But just be ready for any sort of transition, build your resource library so that if somebody has to plug in, you know what you're going to tell them right away, and then lean on your steering committee, the other people in your steering committee to help them out as well, because those steering committee meetings that you have need to be productive, and that person's got to plug right in. So you may have to take a little bit of extra time to get them up to speed.
So Joseph, we had a question come up, and it ties into SSI and the self-study prep visit. So first off, the question speaks to the time distance between attending SSI and having your self-study prep visit. But I would love for you to not only answer that question, but even talk about how the self-study prep visit assisted in the development of your self-study report.
It's a great question. And I believe it was about a year. I think we went to Self-Study Institute, I believe, in November, and then the following October, Dr. Bonfiglio came to campus for us. But when they come, and you're talking about the visit, that preliminary visit, is that what you're talking about, Terrence?
It's the self-study pre-visit when you're meeting with the steering committee and the working group, and you do the presentation for the community.
Oh, for the community?
Well, you know what? Maybe during the time you may not have had your in-person visit because of COVID. Did you actually have?
So you had your preliminary visit with the team chair when they came to campus, or just when Dr. Bonfiglio came to campus?
This is when Bob came to campus and
When
met
Bob came to
with
campus.
a
Okay,
wide
good.
variety of different groups.
Yeah, sorry. I just need to get everything straight. There's so many deadlines. Pardon me, everybody. So
No.
having Dr. Bonfiglio come to campus was great. One thing is too, whenever somebody comes to campus, like our Middle States liaison or the team chair, it's a great opportunity for you to give visibility and time for your steering committee. It's amazing because they do all the work. Remember, they literally do all the work. You facilitate everything, and that's a big job too. But they're the ones that gather the evidence. They're the ones that gather, that put the narrative together. They're the ones that meet the deadlines that you set. So they should get that face time as well. So it's great for them to represent the different standards and what they're finding throughout the university to feel like they're really a part of this creation process. We had a nice draft of our document, like outline of our document ready to go. So that Dr. Bonfiglio can go through it. He was able to talk to President Fry to talk about kind of what he wanted to get from this process as well. So it was a really nice feedback for us. After he saw what we had from our self-study, he was able to give us some feedbacks in areas he thought we could do better on, something he thought we were doing a good job on. So again, it's nice that these deadlines are built into it, these processes, because it helps you. Because this goes from a design template to an outline to a working document to another working document to a finalized copy that goes through about 12 revisions, you know what I mean, to going through maybe a writing revision from the writing center, or to somebody who's writing it in one voice. So every time you can get a review from somebody that has an outside perspective, it's a good opportunity.
And just for clarity, with the self-study design, we just want to let the audience know that's not where you connect the evidence to self-study design. You talk about the method and process of how the team will actually gather evidence and link it to the narrative. Someone had asked a question about the self-study design and whether or not you link evidence to that.
Yeah, sorry,
so
Terrence, I didn't mean to confuse that.
No, this is a separate question. It's actually just following up on what you just said. Just asking, with your self-study design, you did not link evidence to it. You basically talked about in that self-study design how you're planning to build your evidence inventory and all those things.
Yeah, so self-study design, just to be what it really is, you have your priorities for what you want to do with your self-study. You indicate if you want to put it together by standard or by priorities as well. So what your writing format's going to be. You give your steering committee and your working groups so they can see that representative group as well. You talk about kind of what your process is going to be. You provide a timeline. You talk about what you might want your peer evaluation group to be, what sort of traits you might want them to have. So it's really an idea for them to look at your first kind of plan of attack. Like, this is our plan, but we haven't really written anything down yet as far as what our specific goals are. We haven't written any narrative down necessarily for each one. You may have research questions. You may have sort of ideas of where you want to go for each standards, but you're not really talking about narrative or evidence at this point. You could describe kind of what you're doing, but again, that's going to be really superficial because this is pretty early on in the process.
All right, Melissa, would you like to move on? We will get your questions. We're trying to strategically put them in the phases that they relate to, but I'll hand it back over to Melissa.
All right, thank you. So just got through talking a little bit about preparing and planning to enter into this 2.5 year process. Now we're moving to phase 2, which is conducting research. So at this second phase, you're going to be gathering all that evidence, putting it all together in preparation for analysis and so forth. So one of the first tasks in this process is here to gather that data and documentation. And the kinds of questions that the institution should be asking themselves are, in what existing documentation are we likely to find evidence of compliance? Where might there be gaps in documentation, and what can we do to fill them now? It is a long process that allows time to fill those gaps that are inevitably going to surface. The institution should immediately begin collecting information at this phase. Once the documentation is gathered, cataloged, and organized, Joseph spoke to that just a few moments ago, the work of selecting relevant data to analyze can begin in earnest. Of course, this work cannot be done by a few individuals alone. The steering committee should provide working groups with clear charges, along with deadlines and deliverables. All working group reports should have a similar style, structure, format, and voice as much as possible, so as to minimize and facilitate the editorial work to be done later in the process. Of course, reports should also be accurate, so care should be taken to update them as time passes. So it's easy to sort of summarize that really quickly, but it's in fact quite a laborious task. So Joseph, why don't you tell us a little bit about that particular phase for your institution?
Yeah, this is really, really important. So when we went into self-study, obviously we didn't know a pandemic was going to occur. So we had provided some more opportunity to do a more, we thought the co-chairs in our committees would do a lot more of a deep dive as far as where they wanted to go with each one of the standards. And what we found was the vast majority of our co-chairs needed a lot more guidance than we had actually provided on the front end. And in fact, if I had to do it again, I would do it the same way with providing more guidance, more support frameworks, and more ability for them to kind of see what the end product would look like so that they can do some thinking, but have that creative thinking be involved with this guidelines so they know that they're going off track or not. And it can be difficult, I think, sometimes because the standards support each other so much and there's so much sharing that it's really a good opportunity for you to say, okay, you know, here's some standard 3 and standard 5 have a lot of byplay, you know, they go back and forth with a lot of different things. You need to decide as co-chairs, you know, what's going to be in 3 and what's going to be in 5. So those are some of the things you can do from the front. I think what's really important for them too is just to support them with project management and say, okay, here's what we think you should do. We think you should, even to the fact to say, okay, we think you should meet with your working groups every 2 weeks or blah, blah, blah. Here's a Teams group that we set up for you to use. Here's how we expect you to follow up with them, blah, blah, blah. And again, these guidelines that you set from the beginning don't necessarily have to be the organizational system that they follow, but at least it gives them the opportunity to have one in case they don't have the ability or time to set one up in the beginning. Deadlines, deadlines, deadlines. Make sure that they understand what the end product looks like and what each deadline is building up to, because that'll help them understand why they're doing each one of those deadlines. So when we set everything up, we wanted to have a really strict deadline during our research period to have an outline set up so that we could know that people were on the same page, that we knew that they were kind of meeting what our needs that we thought that would be for each one of the different criteria. And then once you had an outline, what we did in our steering committees is we talked about it as a steering committee. Based on your experience with standard 1, do you think that this outline meets what we're needing? Where is it weak? Where is it strong? Where can we supplement? Where does it have some common with standard 7 or standard 6 that we can talk about in the other standard and not in this one? So it gives the opportunity to provide feedback for each standard, but it also gives the other steering committee members that are co-chairs of other committees the opportunity to understand what's going on in other parts as well. Create a repository of materials. We said that before. We had a Teams site because we're a Microsoft campus to host all of our different committee and working group materials. Like I said before, we made the evidence repository. We made it really easy for you not only to upload materials if you wanted to, but we also had a support person do that as well. It was actually set up to where you could do views by standard, by criteria, so you could see what was in there. So that when we went to put this all into the portal later on, it was easy to see, but it was also easy to see what you had and what you didn't have. Make sure you take care of any hurdles possible. So you had that great question before about how do you get sensitive information. If somebody reaches out to you that's having trouble within your steering committee or one of your working groups, you take over. Jump in, make that easier for them. You don't want them to have any frustrations. Their job's hard enough already. So make sure that any hurdles that come up or anybody that's pushing back hard or any deadlines that are not met, or, you know, you have to help with that. My boss used to say that he was always the little Chihuahua or Boston Terrier, like grabbing on people's legs to make sure they did something. Sometimes you have to be that person. And sometimes that's out of your comfort zone. So maybe you find somebody in your steering committee that can help you do that as well. But you have to make sure you knock any hurdles down from them as well. Be a support system for them. It's so critical. I'm a really positive, optimistic person. If I told you as many times as we went into these meetings that I wore a funny hat or just showed ridiculous videos to make sure we eased the tension for that, that's what they needed. And that's what I provided. So figure out what your steering committee needs from you. They may need somebody stern. They may need somebody who, wears a clown nose. I don't know, whatever they need, be that person for them, but also make a safe space for frustration for them too. I can't say that enough. because I said that for you, you have to be that for them too, because they're going to have some people on campus or some things that aren't going well for them. They may even have some of their other job challenges that you can help them with as well as the process goes on. So be that person for them too. Like this is really almost like an elite club that you're going to be with for 2.5 years. So make sure that you can support them in every way. And let me tell you this worked out really well for me. If none of these are your strengths, then set up a steering committee that can support people this way, or make sure that they, if they need it, they find other people that they can do that can support them this way as well. So if you're not a touchy-feely type person like I am, or a cheerleader, you know, like that, you don't have to be that. That's not necessarily how this needs to work. But whatever they need, you have to be able to provide in order to get this done.
I
I
really
hope I
like
didn't
the
scare
way
any- I hope I didn't scare anybody with that. You don't have to wear a clown nose or a chicken suit.
I really like the way you talked through providing a lot of support and structure, even for groups that might ultimately not need it, right? So every culture is different, every institution is different, and for some institutions, a rigid structure is not the way to go. But having some kind of structure in place for those individuals or groups who need it, or who can rely on it or use it as a resource, really important, and I think really good advice. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And one more thing there too, you're going to have standards or chairs or co-chairs of working groups that are absolute superstars. You won't even have to talk to them. They're going to just do everything for you, and they're going to take it beyond what you ever thought it was. Like immediately comes to mind was in charge of Standard 2, Sarah Steinwachs, who's in our College of Media Arts and Designs. I barely even had to touch base with her, and she took Standard 2, which is a difficult one because it goes across a lot of things on campus, to such a level that I never thought we could get to. And then you'll have other people that need more support. And it's not because they don't know what they're doing. They might not have time. You know, they may just need more support than other people do. And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as everybody gets to the finish line, it doesn't matter, you know, what it takes to get them there.
All right, Joseph, are you ready for questions?
Absolutely.
We have a question. We have a question from the audience. What steps should be taken when interviews conducted and evidence gathered identifies issues pertaining to the criteria being addressed and assessed?
It's a great question. I mean, you really want to try to find as many issues as possible. And remember, not for middle states, but if it's an issue for middle state standards, it's probably an issue for your university. So the great thing about this, and the whole point of this, is continuous improvement. So if you're finding issues, then you're finding out things from your university stakeholders that are issues of concern to them that you can help address through the self-study process. Again, that's what this is about. Like finding something on campus that may have been anecdotal, that you can rise to a level, this level, that you can either commit to as a university to solving, or at least looking into, or at least bring to a level where it could be considered for that sort of thing, is what this is all about. So when you get to that point, like that's the good stuff. Every university has issues. There's no perfect university. No, anybody who's trying to tell you that is telling you a story, right? So unearth those issues, be honest about those issues, but talk about what you could possibly do in the future to fix those issues. Know that you're going to have to talk about that later on if you do say it in your self-study. So if you say, we're going to look into this, you're probably going to want to reference that in your next self-study, whether it does. But there were tons of issues on Drexel campus that we wanted to talk about in the self-study, because the self-study kind of gives you a stick to try to move through some of these things that may have been stuck in the sludge for a long period of time. And you have issues on your campus that you've been talking about trying to fix for 2 or 3 years. Guess what? Middle States can help you get through that, because if you commit to that through that, you kind of have to look into that the next time through. So it's interesting process because, you know, people are sometimes weary about talking about issues on campus. And of course, your whole goal is to get reaccredited, but your secondary goal is to talk about things that people want to get better on campus, and talk about things that are going great on campus and focus on those things. And that's what the mixture is. There's so many wonderful things going on everybody's campus, and you should talk about those, but there's also things that you want to fix, and you should talk about that too.
You had discussed early on about your working groups, and a question that we have here is, how do you have that balance between giving explicit direction, but yet giving these groups autonomy with their work?
It's a great question. So I think what you'll do early on is, you know, when I used to, in a former life, when I was a middle school teacher, I was probably the meanest person ever in September and October, right? Because you want to set your guidelines, you want to make sure you're following and showing your consequences, and then you can be nicer as it goes on. And I think that's a good process for this too. You can be very strict as you go forward because you don't know what you're getting, and have lots of guidelines going forward, lots of deadlines to kind of see what people can and can't do, but then give them some autonomy as it goes forth. And really, it's about the deadlines. So if I had some advice, I would say set an early deadline. You could provide some guidelines around it and see who meets that deadline, see who struggles, and see what the quality of work is. You can really build a lot of that in initial deadline to see, okay, here's the people that don't need my help, and here's the people that do. Or if everybody's a mess, I'm not doing a good job explaining exactly what I'm looking for. So it's almost kind of a test of your process. Set an early deadline for something, and then just think about kind of how everybody responds, and then kind of build your process around that going forward. But a lot of people chafe about really strong guidelines. So learn that right away. That goes back to your steering committee. Our steering committee was built of people that we knew pretty well, either me and my boss, and we knew kind of how they worked. We either worked on committees with them before, or we knew them by reputation. And so you could kind of tell, well, they don't need to be micromanaged, or they might need a little bit of help, or they're this. And that's why that staff faculty mix goes together so well, I think, because a lot of times those skill sets of those two people together kind of complement each other. So you can almost think of that way too. I have one person that's a little bit more philosophical, that's a little bit more creative, and I have one person that's a little bit more, will do the work and set up the meetings and do all the organizational stuff. Like that's the marriage you're kind of looking for.
How did you thank your steering committee and make them feel appreciated?
How did I thank them? Oh my gosh, this and things like this. I mean, in every single time that I went in front of a time to talk about that, the first thing I mentioned was my steering committee, because again, they do the work. I cannot talk about them enough, just to be perfectly honest. I think in every meeting that you have with them, you say please, you say thank you, you make them feel great for what they're doing, because it's hard work. And again, nobody on our campus got release time. Nobody on our campus had extra pay. This was everybody's probably 15th job description on that. And we met every other week for 2 years. I mean, this is thankless work in some sense for people on campus. So sometimes the only recognition they're going to get is if you make it so. So I made sure that I took them to meetings when I was presenting. If it was on their standard, they presented, not me. If it was talking about some other issue that they have, they presented, not me. I would introduce them, but it was really their work, and I wanted to make sure that everybody knew it was their work. We had a small reception afterwards too. The president put that together, which was really nice. Communications about it too. But again, I'll be forever thankful for all of my steering committee, because again, I got a lot of credit for this that was not that well, not as deserved as it was for them as well. So it's a great question and a good reminder to thank the people. And that's just I think that's just a good reminder for life too. Make sure people are recognized for the work that they do, and they'll keep doing great work the whole time through.
So we have a question here where the audience member is asking if you have any examples of good standard-based final self-study reports. So it speaks to when you were going through the process, did you have sample reports that you reference, or did you use the items that you had at Self-Study Institute? Can you talk about just how you modeled your self-study report?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's the cool thing also about Self-Study Institute is they do give you access to documents where you can look at kind of that, to where you can really see see what's theoretical and see it in practice. My mentor during this process is a faculty member who is a co-chair of their self-study at Hofstra University, Terry Shapiro. She's wonderful. And I actually went on the site visit and did their site visit with her, and she mentored me through. She's my other mentor this whole process, besides Bob, who I count as a mentor through this as well. I met with her quite a bit. Their self-study was wonderful, and I did a lot of our self-study setups very similar to theirs. But I looked at a couple other documents as well. Because I think if you only look at one document or two, you can kind of get trapped and not maybe see all the different ways you can put something together. I would strongly encourage everybody to look at multiple examples of by standard documents and also by priority documents, because they're two totally different things. We did ours by standard, and I think that that is an easier experience for a reviewer. But I will say now, after having done this, I really like the priority by priority setup for the documents, and I might suggest that for our next self-study. So instead of doing it, hey, here's standard 1, here's standard 2, I would rather use our, our strategic plan priorities and just map the standards to that as well. So see the different examples. You can pick and choose from different criteria to see what fits for each standard for you. But it's also a good way for you to see how you can construct narrative. Because one thing to remember, you're like, oh, I got 100 pages. That's a lot of space, right? It is not a lot of space. 100 pages, there's no way you can describe your whole university in 100 pages. In fact, the programmatic accreditors even give longer space than that. I was working with CEEF for our Dornsife School of Public Health, and their document was like 300 pages long just to describe, one college. So, but I appreciate 100 pages because it makes you be concise. So it's a great way for you to see how to be concise when you talk about, we had 15 pages that we allocated for standard 3. So we had 15 pages to talk about our whole academic enterprise, our faculty, and our research. That's not enough space really to describe everything. So it really makes you be very cognizant of how you use your words and really focus on the evidence, which I believe is what Middle States wants to see anyways. It's not really about what you say, it's about what you can show. So you need to think about what you can say, think about the examples you can provide, and then really show that in your evidence. And that we'll talk about this later on, because one other thing to think about is everybody's going to want a piece of your document. Everybody on your campus is going to want a piece of your document. They're going to want to put in what they're doing, and that's something you have to think about through the whole way through too.
So I have one final question, then we'll transition back to Melissa. In making recommendations for improvement to be included in the self-study report, how did you decide on which ones rose to the level of being included in the report?
That's a great question. And it was something that was a bit of a struggle on our campus, because I will say we had, we probably had more things than we wanted to put down in a self-study, because we knew once we put it in a self-study, we would have to dedicate quite a bit of time towards that. But we also wanted to make sure we were lucky that the majority of our recommendations, and I'll explain this, matched up with a lot of key initiatives that were going on at our campus already. So these were things that we wanted to fix, or we were in the process of fixing. That was our first kind of level look. So what we did was, if we had findings within our document that were not recommendations, for lack of a better word, we left those in our document. We still said these are some areas we want to think about, but we tried to limit the number of recommendations we had to 1 to 2 maximum for each standard. Because if you think about managing internal recommendations and having to comment on that on your next document that you're going through, it's a lot. Even if you have just 1 for each standard, that's 7 that you're gonna have to talk about initiatives. That's a lot of your self-study to talk about. It's also a lot to commit to. So we felt like we didn't want to commit to a large level internal recommendation unless we knew we were going to spend a lot of university time in order to fix it. That doesn't mean that all those findings we weren't going to try to fix as well. It just means they weren't as high priority as the other ones. It was really important for us to leave those findings in there that were unearthed issues that didn't rise to the level of recommendations, because we wanted to feel like the working group's work was represented. We wanted to feel like that feedback that we got from stakeholders had space in our document. And again, we wanted to show, hey, there's some things we're going to try to do, but we're going to do our best to fix it. But that's not in our 1 to 2, 3 year plan, or may not be in the next. These are the ones, the 5, 6 things that we're going to work on specifically. And that's kind of what our thought process was. That's a great
Thank
question.
you, Joseph.
Because you're going to have
Thank you.
you're going to unearth a lot of issues. So, but you need to prioritize that. And that's really hard for some people to understand, how you can dedicate university resources one way or the other.
Melissa, back to you.
Okay, so we're at the top of the hour now. We're halfway through the phases. We're going to pause for a commercial break just to remind everyone that since July 1, 2023, we have the Standards for Accreditation Requirements of Affiliation 14th edition that are joined by the Evidence Expectations by Standard. That document Joseph referred to a little bit ago, which guides institutions toward the minimum requirements for evidence. And some of those items might be applicable, some might not be. But these are really the backbone and the resources that you should reflect on and refer to continuously throughout the process. So I'm going to turn it over to Terrence and let him take it away.
Thank you, Melissa. In this webinar, we've discussed two important phases to jumpstart the self-study report process: planning and preparing, as well as conducting research. As we move into this section move further on into the discussion, we will now focus on forming the drafts of the self-study report. The steering committee or some other designated group will begin to collect reports from its working group. To aid in the conversion of these reports into one single document, parameters should have been established with working groups to have their reports be consistent in style, format, and structure. Many institutions will include some type of style guide to assure that the working groups can achieve these outcomes. We cannot stress enough that the self-study report should be written in one voice and should be edited for accuracy, consistency, and continuity. Once the self-study report is drafted, the steering committee should seek the opinions of diverse campus group members. For the working group, the draft should be shared as their product. The community review of the self-study report builds consensus. All governing bodies should review the documents to ensure consistency as well. So Joseph, I'd like to bring you back to the discussion to kind of talk about this critical phase of the self-study report. Can you first talk about your experience in collecting multiple reports from working groups and beginning that consolidation of information?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think I think you need to think about it as a co-chair on how you can get from standards to thought process behind what your priorities are for each criteria, to outlines, to working drafts supported by evidence, to, drafts that are being revised. It's a lot of thought and it's a lot of different steps involved. And I think what was effective for us is modeling all this. So if you want to get an outline, you need to, as a co-chair, kind of show them in your steering committee, this is what an outline looks like. This is what I expect. And then have somebody do it and then make sure you share it within your committee. When you want to start writing a draft, take just one criteria at a time and have a draft and share that review within your steering committee so that you can see kind of what that looks like. So not only can you have people giving advice on a criteria, but they can understand how that can kind of fit into their criteria as well. So it's very iterative. Definitely start with an outline. What you don't want to do is have people get really far into the process with no feedback and then have to redo work. So really set up steering committee meetings around deadlines that can focus on specific ideas. If you can dedicate more than one steering committee, say, okay, this meeting, we're going to talk about standard 1. They're going to share their outline. We're going to talk about that and think about any things they might be missing, talk about evidence, blah, blah, blah. And the next committee meeting, we're going to talk about standard 2. By the time you get through it, and you can do maybe more than one, just depends on how fast you work. By the time you get through it, you can think about it like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. By the time you start on one side and you're done, you got to go back and start on the other side again. So if I started with 1 and 2, then I do 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 in compliance, and I start back on 1 and 2. So you can start to think about any sort of organizational ways to look through it. But I say set deadlines, be very prescriptive with what you're looking for. But again, give them opportunity to deviate a little bit as long as it makes sense, as long as you have that conversation with them. So I tried to have a document for everything with instruction and a template for literally everything that I was asking. And that evolved through the process of learning how they needed to be supported. I also, before the evidence suggestions I developed my own suggested evidence for each one of these things. So they knew kind of what they were looking for. And I tried to make it as specific for our campus as possible. So guidelines, templates, modeling, discussion, opportunities to critique, give critique, like those are all effective practices for us.
Great. Well, Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you, see if there are any questions from the audience.
Well, here's one question that's, we could say it's, pardon me, kind of philosophical, but also practical and pragmatic. So as you think about the writing of the self-study report, what are your thoughts on composing this report in such a way that it truly can become a living document that the institution uses far beyond the reaffirmation process?
It's a great question. I mean, I would hope this is the goal of everybody that goes through this, because this is the way to make this be meaningful and be integrated into your work. And so for us, it was really key to do this while we were going through our strategic planning process. Like that was super helpful for us because while we were going through our strategic planning process, not only were we developing the priorities for the university to 2030, which is coincidentally when we'll have our next review, but we also were talking about initiatives on campus that could be the focus of self-study or be the focus of our accreditation document. So as we were doing the pre-work and research for our strategic plan, then forming the committees, doing the work, when they were unearthing issues on campus and unearthing and creating these larger initiatives, we built that into our self-study. And then we went to stakeholders that were going to work on that and ask them questions about that to make sure that it was corroborated. Like everything that they said was things that were actually relevant on campus. And then we really tried to talk to as many people on campus that were involved with specific areas as possible in order to make sure what they needed was put into the document. So for instance, Standard 4 talking about the support of students. We had people involved with all aspects of that area share their thoughts, make sure that they were part of the revision process to make sure that they felt like they got a good idea of what Drexel was doing in the support services and to make sure what the next goals would be for them as well. So it's really important that you think about that as far as what's going on your campus to make sure you kind of model that as much as you can. But also, I was very fortunate to have really great executive sponsors. Like I said before, the provost and the president gave me time after we had our external report to present to academic council, to present to president's executive council, present to cabinet and say, hey, here's what Middle States said. Here's also what we committed to, and here's what we're going to do. And I was able to have my steering committee chairs come in for each standard and talk about what the internal and potentially external recommendations were for each standard and talk about what initiatives were already going on to make sure that we were going to address that going forward. And one thing that I'm developing now too, which you can do this or not, is I'm putting together a Middle States annual report. So for each year, I'm meeting with the people that are working on the different internal and external recommendations we have to get updates on that. And then I'm going to do that in order to keep us on track, but it's also another communication and transparency type thing to say, hey, Middle States is still around, even though they're not here. These are the things that we had identified and the things that they identified that we need to work on. And here's what we've done after a year and a half after we've been here. And I'm going to do that every year until we get back to self-study again. So by the time we get back to self-study, not only do people know what we've accomplished, but it'll be easy for me to say, hey, this is for your standard. Here's all that we've accomplished based on what they told us we needed to do or what we told us we needed to do. So they don't have to write that section again. Hope that answers that question.
I think we're ready to move on to refining the report.
Thanks, Melissa. And Joseph, thank you for sharing your insights. As we move towards the final phase of refining the report, the steering committee has taken all the feedback from its campus groups and updated the report. Here is where we asked for the evaluation team chair to review the self-study report for clarity from an outsider and to offer any other helpful feedback. As we said earlier, the report, as you go through the revision process, to refer back to the self-study design, as it was your foundation, kind of where you started, and made some very important changes to make sure that you eliminate jargon and trite phrases. Again, Joseph talked about the real estate that you have in those 100 pages. It's very important to be direct with your language. Also, to eliminate redundancies. Carefully analyze seemingly contradictory data. So you may say one thing in one chapter and another, just making sure there's consistency across the board, and to avoid the passive voice. As the self-study report transforms into the final document, continue to monitor the organization of the evidence inventory as well. Don't let the evidence inventory be a data dump, as it's essential to curate the evidence. Which pieces best tell the story. Using a naming convention is intuitive and easy for the peer evaluators to understand is one helpful tip. All documents must be in PDF form. You're limited to 5 links, choose wisely. Review the institutional portal to become familiar with it. And this is where obviously the uploads are going to happen. And think of the team that's reviewing. So if we move on to our next slide, we're going to talk to Joseph about that piece of pulling everything together and getting the community buy-in or review of the document. Can you talk about your experiences, Joseph?
Sure. So like I said, some of this is repeat of what I had from before. So you have your administrative champions, of course, so that you can make sure that you can get whatever evidence you need, can get whatever meetings you need. I will say everybody was wonderful on my campus, specifically around the time where we got to the site visit. I got everything that we needed along the way. So that was really great. Make sure your deadlines are enforced. It's a slippery slope for you not to enforce deadlines. And you might be a nice person. I know I certainly struggle with this and say, okay, the deadline is the 31st, and then the person doesn't have it on the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th. It's a slippery slope from the beginning if you start not enforcing deadlines. So be strict in the beginning to make sure that you don't have to be strict all the way through the process. Like I said, work backwards is really important. If you go from the back end and you allocate amount of time for each thing to be done, it's much easier to schedule. So everything takes longer than you think it does. So just allocate more time for each section. Review takes a long time, just so you know. We were fortunate to have somebody in our writing center work on this, and I was very fortunate that towards the end of our process, a lovely gentleman named Jim Gardner, who works our president, actually rewrote our whole document into one voice afterwards, which made it truly wonderful. He took a great document and made it truly wonderful, just something that we really needed towards the end. I'm not saying that's everybody's process should be. I was lucky enough to have that. But you should do these revisions to put it in one voice. We felt like it was very difficult for us as a steering committee to rewrite the document into one voice or to say this is how it specifically has to be written. So we wanted to focus on content, and then we handed that off to our writing center and this other gentleman to rewrite it for us. If you can find that, that's effective practice, because then your working committees don't have to worry about diction. They don't have to worry about necessarily what their voice is. They can just put the content in there. I think that worked for us. Let's see. Oh yeah, and like I said before, having somebody to track the evidence and make sure it's updated in our system too. I really liked your point, Terrence, about making sure the evidence is there, because again, you could be collecting evidence for a year and a half and that could be outdated. So putting a date on your evidence to make sure it's the right evidence by the time it goes into there. It's like we were collecting evidence in 2021 and we were submitting it in 2022. Well, a lot of things change over that time. So just make sure that that evidence meets with that. And I think that really helps. The revision of this, what we found to be very effective is that instead of doing revision, say, hey, whole executive committee, why don't you review the whole document, all 100 pages? We tried to focus in our revision on the people that were the experts in that area. So I mentioned that before on Standard 4. We had our person that was in charge of enrollment management and student success, plus his upper team, review Standard 4 to look at that, to make sure we had included everybody. For Standard 3, we spent a lot of times with our deans looking at it. We spent a lot of times with our provost looking at it, with our vice provost looking at it to make sure everything was in there as well. But that takes a lot of time. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Make sure that when you're reviewing things, you let them know, hey, we're reviewing to make sure that we're saying everything here. I'm not giving the opportunity to add 4 pages into this document that's already overloaded too. So make sure you let them know kind of what the expectations are when they're reviewing. One thing that I did that I found that was really helpful was with having so many colleges and schools at Drexel, is I met individually with each dean on campus, and I asked them simple questions like, what are the things that you're most proud of that your school's doing? What are the things that you've been doing over this long term that you're struggling with? And we tried to find space in the document for those. If not within the narrative, we did it in the evidence. And I found such great stuff. But not only that, I learned an amazing amount about the things that are going on campus. And it was cool to link those things together. And they provided me with a lot of things to think about, but they also felt represented in the process as well. So as many voices as you can get yourself, but also with your teams, it is a great way to look at this as you're going forward. And just kind of think about how, the more time you spend, the more time people will feel involved with the process, is I guess the point I'm trying to make. We'll stop rambling on that.
Great. So Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you, see if we have any questions from the audience.
Sure. Just one question for now. And it's related to what Joseph was commenting on just a moment ago. What's the sweet spot of addressing within the new self-study report recommendations that were made in the prior self-study report?
It's a great question. I mean, I think I'm going to learn about that in our next one too. I think I think if you do it correctly, you will actually just have it integrated into it and you won't even have to spell it out that much. So I'm thinking of one example for us. We wanted to review our program review process, and we're going from a longer review process to now going into an annual review process. So for me, talking about annual program review is going to be a big part of standard 3 and big part of standard 5 for me. So I can just say, hey, by the way, last time we had a recommendation, an internal recommendation that we wanted to review our process, and here it is. Because that's going to be a big part of what I'm talking about anyways. So I think it's kind of just finding that, like, if you can make it just be integrated in without having to go in length about what you had from before. And then if you need to talk about all the process you went through, which we certainly would, then I can have all these evidence documents that kind of have more detail about it. So I think if you've done correctly, it won't take a chunk of your space to talk about. It was an internal recommendation. You could just say it was internal, or it was an external recommendation, or it was a requirement for me to talk about this, or collegial advice, and this is what we did. Because I think those sorts of things will be big parts of your self-study already anyways. It's a great question, because I've been thinking about that too.
Here's another question. And the question is specific here, but we could broaden it to apply to more individuals. So the question is, what suggestions might you have for junior faculty who are also simultaneously working toward meeting the requirements for tenure and promotion? But for that, we could substitute any individual who has
Yeah.
other pressures and obligations that they have to attend to.
So advice for them doing accreditation, or just
I
advice?
think in being involved in the steering committee or in the self-study
yeah.
process.
Oh, I think this is for everybody. I really, really do. I think that the people on this, we had lots of faculty that had never been involved before. And I think the advice I would give to anybody on this is just understand the time restraints of the time you need to be involved with this. If you have a lot of time to give, maybe you could be a co-chair. But if you don't have a lot of time to give, you could be on a working committee and be a very valuable member of each team. Because like I said before, you don't have to be an expert on each one of these things on campus. You can become that as you go through this process. Even if you've never learned about, the finances of the university, which is difficult for most of us, including myself. Standard 6 is a mystery for me, right? I need the most help with standard 6. But if you're learning about it, it's a great way to learn about the university as a whole. And I think that anybody can be involved with this. And I think the great thing about it is it gets you more involved with the service aspect of not only understanding the university, but like you said, when you were introducing me, we have 30 programmatic accreditors on campus. And not every college or school has somebody who's specifically dedicated to doing accreditation. It's generally a faculty member or a department head that's doing it, along with all the other things that they're doing. So to have more support and understanding within colleges is beneficial. I will put a plug in for being a peer evaluator for Miller States. Anyone can do this as well too. Anybody who's been on a campus, and you will learn so much about a university and how it works. It's just a benefit for you to do this. And again, it's also for networking. Again, I said it was a committee of 100 people. Most of our committees were 15, 16 people. You're going to meet people you never had the opportunity to meet before. You're going to get some exposure with people you may not, maybe you're presenting in front of the provost or academic council or board of trustees. Like, there's a lot of opportunities that could be open. But again, it's all just depending on kind of what you're looking for. You can go to a committee and just be a part of it. You can help them research. You can help them do writing. There's all sorts of areas for people to work within this space. You could just be the person that collects evidence. There's so many different ways for you to get involved with this that it's really open for anybody on campus. We had students that were working on our committees too. And again, they're as busy as anybody else, but really they can just provide advice, and they can provide that voice that we're looking for on campus too. You always get the long answer from me. Sorry about that. I'm chatty Cathy. You got to clip my string.
Melissa, are there any other questions?
I think we can move on. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, during this webinar, we've given helpful guidance and Joseph's lived experience in the 4 phases of the self-study report: planning and preparation, conducting research, writing the report, and refining the report. Now we'd like to transition to some other important factors related to the self-study report. So in terms of branch campuses and additional locations, and we'll circle back to Joseph to see if he had to experience this, but what we have here are just some helpful tips in terms of managing these very important aspects of the evaluation process. If an institution has a branch campus, it must be visited. If an institution has 3 or more additional locations, at least 1/3 must be visited. Please know that the visitation of additional locations is a collaborative decision with the team chair, institutional representatives, and the commission staff. The timing of the visits of branch campuses and/or additional locations can be done before or during the evaluation visit to the main campus. Lastly, the team chair and the vice chair will make the assignments related to the visit. We talked about uploading the report to the portal. This is just a brief slide that kind of speaks to that process. Upload report is where you'll upload the self-study narrative report. Click the upload file button to navigate to your self-study report. Select the file, click open, and now you'll see your document that's ready for upload. Click the blue save button at the bottom of your page to complete the upload. Our accreditation services unit will send a reminder email to institutions as to when the report should be uploaded. If you have any questions or encounter any challenges, feel free to reach out to your vice president liaison and/or any commission staff. What we have next is sort of milestones. We talked about, at least Joseph identified certain areas throughout his experience that he needed to monitor. Here, we have very important milestones to consider. After the team chair's preliminary visit, there's a lot of work that happens on the side of the chair and the commission in terms of confirming the visits. And there's really, again, a lot of things that happen before, during, and after. And I think charts like this just give the institution an idea of there's always work to do. Just when you think one thing is over, there's an ability to kind of continue on and move on to another important factor if it's something that the institution has to do or you're waiting for a decision from the team and/or middle states. In the next slide, you see as we get closer to the visit, there's some things that kind of fall on the responsibility of the institution, as well as the team, the vice chair and/or the team chair. Again, as you get closer, it's really more fine tuning, making sure schedules are aligned. Everyone knows what they're doing, especially on campus. And then, of course, you know, the actual evaluation visit happens. But I think this would be a great point to bring Joseph back in to share some thoughts about this process. Joseph.
Yeah, the one I was thinking about the most today is don't be married to anything. My wife is a graphic designer by trade, and I remember her talking a while back and her saying, don't be married to anything that you put together in the creative process. Because I just wanted to reiterate that this isn't your document. You know, you're going to fall in love with sections of this document that maybe be reduced or maybe be enlarged, whatever, because that's where your president, potentially provost, want those directions want to go. That's a really good point. Don't be. It's yours. It's your baby, right? Because you've been cultivating it for so long. But remember, there may be changes in the long term. When you get chair feedback on your document, it's kind of like gold because they're kind of guiding you to where they think you could go with your document. They're going to have conversations with your president, have conversations with your steering committee, and you can really ask them pointed questions like, these are where we want to go with our document. Did we meet those goals? Are there other things you want to think about? It's just a great opportunity to get a president or a provost in the university to have perspective on your document, perspective on your university, and also to say kind of like, maybe you should think about this a little bit more, or maybe here's some things that I think that you could focus on a little bit more. When you get a really good team chair who's really evaluative, it's just really an amazing way to get another, you know, a great set of eyes on the document. Be flexible with the narrative and your evidence too. Be very cognitive of evidence. You know, you want to provide as much evidence as you can, but sometimes you go overboard. Like I said, it was very tempting for me to provide evidence from every college and school at Drexel's campus to make sure that they felt represented, but that's just too much evidence. When you're doing every bit of evidence times 14, it's too much evidence, or it's too much narrative. But then you want to strike a balance between making sure you represent all the good things that are going on in all your colleges and schools. Be prepared to answer additional questions. You may think that you were as thorough as possible, but you never really know the direction that the peer reviewers are going to go in, what they may want to see. It's hard to take a step back and say, okay, here's where we're strong and here's where we're weak. So be prepared, all hands on deck 6 weeks before. That's when your document gets uploaded and when they start to review it before the site visit. Be prepared for extra questions. That's up until and during the site visit itself. So you need to make sure as a co-chair that everybody's available. And I mean, everybody is available to answer questions. Get those dates on everybody's calendars. The president, the provost, the CFO, the deans, whoever's in charge of student support, everybody across campus needs to be available to answer questions. Do an additional meeting if needed. Make sure that everybody's locked up as much as possible. You may say, well, that's impossible on my campus. Well, you need to find a way to make it work. Just to be perfectly honest. That's super stressful too. When it's Tuesday at 5 p.m. of your site visit and they need to talk to somebody, you need to be able to say, okay, I'm going to put you on the line with somebody. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But again, you're trying to avoid, something that's potentially negative that you could fix in the short term.
Thank you, Joseph. So as we get to, we basically talked about the big event of having the evaluation visit. One of the things we want to impress upon the audience is that, yes, preparing for the evaluation visit and all the things that led up to it and conclude the visit are important, but there's still remaining things to tend to. Here, we've listed some important items. One is that once the team completes its report, the institution will receive a draft of the report. And there's an exchange between the team chair and the institution where the institution has the ability to actually review the report for factual corrections. If there's any information that may be incorrect that's related to actual data or fact, this is where that happens. There is an opportunity for institutions to actually respond to the report, and that's through the institutional response. And that is done through the portal. So basically, the draft is given back to the team chair. The team chair will upload the report to the portal. The institution will reply to the report through the institutional response. And then the team chair will complete what is called a team chair confidential brief. And that basically concludes the evaluation reporting cycle. Note that we do have a multi-level analysis through our review process. So the team went through its process. At this stage, the Committee on Evaluation Reports will review not the team report, the evidence associated with it, along with the narrative, and also interact with the team chair and the vice chair. They will be a part of that discussion. The recommendations from the Committee on Evaluation Reports will be given to the full commission, where the commission action will be rendered. And again, the school will be notified of the commission action. So a lot of work happens even after the subsequent visit. So Melissa, I know we have about 2 minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions out there that we want to hit before we close.
I think a good way to wrap up is just to ask Joseph if you can share a few parting words of encouragement for those who are about to undertake this exercise.
Yeah, I will say, I saw a question that said, what would you do differently? I just want to tell you, you're all going to feel like you want to do something differently after you're done, and that's fine. It's almost, like I said, 100 pages in documents, not enough to cover everything you can about your campus. So don't sweat it. If you get through the end of the process and you give your best effort and you're representative, and you should be proud of that. Because there's going to be things that you wish you would have done differently afterwards. I could have a whole hour and a half on things that I wish I would have done differently. And it doesn't change the fact that I was the most proud when I was done with that document than I've ever been in my entire career. I also want to be perfectly honest, broke down and cried in a meeting because I felt so much stress for this. So I want you guys to be prepared for the roller coaster emotions. Maybe you handle stress a little better than I do. But you're going to have some highs and you're going to have some lows. That's why you got to have your support system ready for you too. I really think that this process can be really incredible for a campus to do if you make it that way. If you make it representative and you make it integrated, it can be very, very meaningful for you on your campus. And I just wanted to say, don't sweat the small stuff. because the big stuff is the stuff you should be worried about, because that's the part that you want to make sure your university is represented in the biggest way. Don't care about naming conventions or the typeface that you use or that kind of stuff. Just focus on the large things, and then just, make sure that you make it meaningful. I mean, that's the best way. Like, if that's your goal and you say it from the beginning, keep saying it and keep knocking down doors to make sure it is that way.
Thank you, Joseph. Here in our last slide, we just revisiting our learning outcomes to understand the purpose and significance of the self-study report, identify the essential elements that make your story stand out, develop effective approaches to editing your group reports, identify strategies to soliciting feedback from the campus community, apply strategies to gather and present supportive data and evidence, and enhance your report's impact with visual aids. At this point, I would like to thank Joseph Hawk for all the valuable information that he provided for the audience, and my colleague Melissa for all that she added, and of course our Middle State staff that supported this webinar. Thank you for attending. Please go to our website to see other webinars that are coming up. Follow us on social media, but have a great day. And again, thank you for attending.
And Terrence, can I just say, if anybody has follow-up questions, please reach out to me. I'm always happy to answer questions.